Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cybercrime Crackdown and How It Affects You, a webinar by LMG Security. My name is Natalie Adams, and I'm your moderator for today. Our presenters for the webinar today are Sherry Davidoff and Matt Duran. Sherry Davidoff is the CEO of LMG Security and author of Data Breaches. As a recognized expert in cybersecurity and data breach response, Sherry has been called a quote, security badass by the New York Times. Her professional experiences are featured in the book Breaking and Entering, the extraordinary story of a hacker called Alien. Sherry is a GIAC certified forensic examiner and penetration tester, receiving her degree in computer science and electrical engineering from MIT. Matt Duran is the director of training and response for LMG Security, a BlackCat instructor as well. A seasoned forensics professional, Matt specializes in incident response, ransomware cases, cryptojacking, and banking Trojans. He regularly conducts cybersecurity webinars and seminars for hundreds of attendees in all sectors, including banking, retail, healthcare, government, and more. Matt holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Montana and previously worked as a blue team field technician and system administrator for over 10 years. His malware research has been featured on NBC Nightly News. And along with Karen Sprenger, Sherry and Matt are co-authors of the new book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion, which will be published later this year. Sherry, at this time, I'm passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Natalie. It's always a pleasure to speak with everybody. Today, we're going to start off by talking about some of the recent criminal busts that have been hitting the headlines. Some of the results of this are shifting adversary tactics as the criminals are under pressure from law enforcement and international government agencies. So we're going to look at what those shifting tactics are and how they affect you. We'll talk about how the law enforcement tracks down the criminals using cryptocurrency and again, some of the impacts of that. Then we'll dive into data exposure trends and privacy laws that are in part a result of that. We'll talk about new incident reporting requirements, ones that have already been enacted and ones that may be enacted. And finally, we'll talk about proactive measures that you need to take in order to protect your organization.
You've probably noticed a lot of criminals are getting busted lately. And over the past few years, we've had many questions, particularly from this audience. Why aren't cyber criminals getting busted? Why aren't they being held to justice? How come law enforcement can't just find them? Well, seems like they've figured it out. Just in the past 6-8 months, we've seen repeatedly over and over groups actually getting taken down and then arrested. So Matt, tell us what we're looking at. What's all this money on the screen?
Yeah, so this is a very small portion, I believe 1 shoebox out of 50 that was recovered during a raid on the Qlocker ransomware gang inside the Ukraine. Qlocker is famous for infamous for the Excellion breach and a number of other high-profile attacks. But the picture really illustrates exactly how profitable this can be and how difficult it can be to maintain that or access to those kind of funds if you're not incredibly careful about how they're used. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we go into cryptocurrency. But Qlocker wasn't the only one. We saw an unattributed ransomware operator or group of ransomware operators also busted in the Ukraine within the last 6 months. We saw a Canadian citizen who was a member of the NetWalker ransomware team get busted for multiple attacks within the U.S. We saw an Asian cybercrime ring that was famous for fraud and theft get taken down, and $83 million of their ill-gotten gains were intercepted by authorities. So, I mean, this is just a few examples of what's happening, but thankfully, this is becoming more of a trend as we move forward, and I'm interested to see where we go with this.
So REvil is probably the biggest bust that's been in the news recently, right, Matt? I don't think any of us expected Russia to be arresting members of the REvil ransomware gang, but they basically put out an information product showing us that this was the case. So what you're looking at on the screen is a photograph released by Russia, and they also included a video as well showing operators of the REvil ransomware gang getting arrested. It also included one member affiliated with the Dark Side gang, which was behind the Colonial Pipeline attack. So this was just in January. Matt, anything you wanted to add there?
No, I think you hit all the really high points on that. Again, this is it shows that kind of interplay between cyber criminal groups and what can happen if we go after a big fish like REvil. We end up catching some of the smaller fish along the way, like the single hacker who was allegedly responsible for the Colonial attack.
So why are we seeing such investment in bringing criminals to justice? Well, a big part of that is because of the rapid increase in crime and profits that some cyber criminals are making. This is a screenshot from Chainalysis, their 2022 crypto crime report that recently came out. And in 2021, there were $14 billion of cryptocurrency payments made to known illicit addresses. So that's a $14 billion industry. And this is almost certainly an underestimate. As you're going to see in this presentation, criminals are starting to turn to using types of cryptocurrency that are more difficult to trace, like Monero and others. So again, this is just a smaller percentage of the whole. We know it's at least $14 billion. So again, let's talk about why the United States government and others are investing so much in these takedowns. We're also seeing some huge impacts of cyber attacks. This is one from just this week. Expeditors, which is a global shipping company, was taken down by a ransomware attack. It forced the operations offline. And right now we do not need any more supply chain disruptions, right? Unfortunately, this continues to happen. Swissport International had to ground all of their flights because of a cyber extortion attack as well. And as you can see on the right, in addition to disrupting the operations, the criminals also are dumping or really threatening to leak their sensitive data. You can see at the bottom there, if you're interested in buying the whole dump, 1.6 terabytes of data, or some part of it, reach us. So they're willing to peddle that information online if the victim doesn't pay them for it, and in some cases, even if the victim does. We're now seeing attacks, ransomware attacks where data was also exfiltrated. Those stats are up to 83.3%. Why are we talking so much about ransomware? Because obviously ransomware is not all of cybercrime, but it sure does make up a lot of it, especially when it comes to the big impacts. Recently, there was a report put out by Sophos detailing what types of attacks they were asked to respond to. 79% of those were ransomware attacks, and quite a few others were precursors that often lead up to ransomware attacks. So you can see Cobalt Strike, we often find that in a precursor to a ransomware attack, web shells, data exfiltration. In some cases, these are just potential ransomware cases that were caught a little sooner than that. Some other impacts of cyber attacks are not always as easy to quantify. In addition to the downtime, which we know can be weeks or more, you can see the total cost of a data breach, which is also a ransomware attack, on average was $4.62 million last year. This is according to IBM. 32% of companies hit with ransomware lost top leadership, either because they were forced to resign or they chose to resign. And then the layoffs are one piece that I think is not commonly tracked. On the screen here, you can see different industries listed. And after a ransomware attack, this is the percentage of them that had to report layoffs. As you can see, financial services, almost a quarter of financial services organizations that were hit with ransomware had to lay people off. Similar stats when it comes to healthcare, and that number creeps up for technology, manufacturing, all the way up to the legal industry, where almost half of those organizations had to lay people off after a ransomware attack, which makes sense because that can be very disruptive. It can also cause lawsuits and other types of liability. So with all of this damage being caused throughout our society, the United States government last year really began a concerted effort to disrupt cyber criminals. And they've been specifically targeting ransomware gangs, but as we can see, that affects all of cybercrime. And here's their 4-point plan. Number one, they want to disrupt ransomware infrastructure and the actors. So you can see on the right, there was a bust just in January where they took down a VPN service that was used by the criminals. They're just trying to make it a little bit harder every day for the criminals to operate. Matt, what was that quote about sand and grit?
Sand and friction.
Oh, sand and friction. Thank you. Yeah. So they're just, can you put that in context for us?
Yeah, so the basic discussion was how do we make cyber criminals a little more hesitant to engage in their activities? And the basic conclusion is if we make it more difficult for cyber criminals to operate, obviously that's going to cut down on the amount of cybercrime. So the NSA came out and said they were approaching the cybercrime situation with a sand and friction type of strategy, basically just putting up as many roadblocks as they can along the way, making it as difficult as they can for cyber criminals to, one, execute their hacks, and then two, profit from them.
Yeah, and you can see that over time it is working. Let's step into the REvil ransomware bust and see how it works. So REvil was the #1 most common ransomware strain last year. IBM just came out a couple days ago with their X-Force report, and it said, as you can see in the headline, REvil dominated ransomware activity in 2021. And some of their attacks, remember, REvil is not just like one small group. That's something important. They are a ransomware as a service gang, which means that they provide a platform for launching ransomware. They operate based on a franchise model, so other cyber criminals will license access to that platform. Presumably there's also some tools or instructions, and then they can use that to hack their victims. So criminals around the world have used the REvil ransomware as a service platform to disrupt the supply chain. We saw with JBS Foods, they ended up disrupting the beef supply chain. They were associated with the Colonial Pipeline hackers. We saw this summer that REvil was used to launch mass zero-day exploits using by exploiting a zero-day vulnerability in the Kaseya remote management and monitoring software. And as a result of that, we saw a $70 million ransom. We saw thousands of organizations around the world that were hit with a ransomware attack and ended up having operational impacts as a result, everyone from grocery stores to healthcare clinics and more. So they've been a very, very damaging organization. I suspect they're not that organized. So what's the response to this? Again, the first step in the US government's plan is to disrupt. And we saw that in July when REvil's website was taken down. Their servers were taken down, and that was reported in the news. And Matt, I don't know if you remember our conversation at the time, but I was like, yeah, they'll be back up. And they were, but it actually took a while. It took over a month, and they were clearly not operating as effectively as they were before. And then in October, governments hacked into the REvil servers and took them down, which is huge. And this is part of that coordinated attack, where, first of all, the U.S. government is offering rewards. So as part of the Transnational Organized Crime Rewards Program that actually has been out for several years, they more recently announced a $10 million reward for any information on REvil and the DarkSide ransomware gang leaders. And then the other piece of what they're trying to do, in addition to disrupting that infrastructure, is they want to leverage international cooperation. And we've seen them really acting on that as well. So in the fall, they developed the International Counter Ransomware Initiative, and then they actually had a 30-country ransomware summit where they brought everyone together to figure out solutions for tackling ransomware. And this is part of that international cooperation that has led to these busts. So what's the result? Well, first of all, criminals are sad, right, Matt?
They are.
You're so sad. Tell us about this.
Yeah, we got to see an interesting kind of peek behind the curtain in an interview with an alleged REvil affiliate for the website lenta.ru. And some of the comments that were made really showed that there is a concerted effect from the increase in law enforcement activity and the potential for these cyber criminals to be busted. The quote here is great. You're afraid all the time. You wake up in fear. You go to bed in fear. You hide yourself in public places. You even hide from your wife and girlfriend. That really puts it in a really good perspective as to what the underlying emotional state of a lot of ransomware operators must be and how terrifying it is to have law enforcement breathing down your neck constantly like that.
There's still people behind the keyboard. Again, a result of this is some ransomware actors are just trying to lay low, and they come out and say this. So one REvil affiliate said, you can hit the jackpot once, but provoke such a geopolitical conflict that you will be quickly found. It's better to quietly receive stable, small sums from mid-sized companies. So if you are a mid-sized company or even a small company, watch out, because you will pay more than an individual for sure. So they're going to target you, but what they don't want is to have the Eye of Sauron law enforcement on them. They're not trying to trigger international law enforcement because they don't want to get caught. And you can see that in these statistics. This is a chart released by Coveware that shows a huge percentage of ransom payments are now being made by small organizations, 11 to 100 people, or mid-size, 101 to 1,000 people. That's the vast majority of those payments. So Matt, why don't you show us an example? I know Qlocker is pretty recent. What are they doing and what's working?
Yeah, so Qlocker is kind of is a great example of how some operators are kind of harkening back to the older days of ransomware when large-scale targets were not really the intention. The idea was to hit a wide range of targets, use a smaller ransom amount to, as was pointed out in the last slide, have a consistent stream of these ransoms coming in. This also helps to avoid some of the more common pitfalls that operators run into when law enforcement begins to get involved. Qlocker is the example of this that we're going to use for today, but there are many others like this. Qlocker in April of last year started exploiting vulnerabilities in the QNAP network attached or NAS devices, NAS storage devices. They were able to gain access to these devices, and then without using any malware whatsoever, they were able to encrypt the contents of those devices using the 7-zip program that's already there. And then they would put a 32-character password on there and ransom the organization for the return of that password. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. The ransoms were very, very low. It was only about $500 to unlock your system, as opposed to the millions of dollars we're kind of used to hearing about with other ransomware attacks. This also meant that very few victims had to report this either to their insurance or to law enforcement or anyone else. They just kind of paid the $500, got their key, and went off. So we don't have a very clear look at the actual impact from this. We know it was disruptive, but not for a very long amount of time. And then Qlocker just closed their doors after about a month after raking in about $350,000 in ransoms. Very effective strategy. It's kind of what GandCrab used to do, where they had a shotgun blast approach to deploying their ransomware across the internet. But again, this is a trend that we're seeing. We're moving back into these lower profile kind of attacks where there isn't really those big red flag moments that end up involving law enforcement or other regulatory agencies.
So one thing I think is especially interesting at this case, Matt, is that it's ransomware without the ransomware, right? It reminded me when we were talking of those old Polly-O string cheese commercials. Okay, how many of you are from the 80s and 90s? Come on, raise your hands. Any of you remember the old Polly-O string cheese? I want a pizza without the crust and without the sauce. That's what we have today. So ransomware without the ransomware. And the reason they're doing this is because it's a lot less likely to trigger antivirus. They also don't have to purchase commercial malware. They can just use tools that are free and may already be installed on the system. I know just this morning, we saw the CrowdStrike annual report come out, their annual threat update, and that really just solidified our view on this trend. Matt, do you want to describe to us what they have put in the report?
Yeah, so there were two statistics right at the head of the report that we thought were really interesting and very relevant to what we're talking about today. And that's the e-crime breakout time, which is the time it takes for an adversary to move farther into your network after they gain their initial foothold, and then the tools that they're using to do that. So we're seeing a time, according to CrowdStrike, of about an hour and 38 minutes between when they gain initial access and when they make that first jump into the rest of your system. This means that there is this very, very tight time frame for you to catch these attacks in progress before they become very destructive. And next we see the tactics that they're employing. This is from quarter 4 of 2021, also from CrowdStrike. 62% of the time when adversaries were acting inside of a system, they were doing so without using malware. They were using software that was already installed in the system, was already approved for use by the organization, and again, would be very difficult to detect with traditional antivirus and traditional security software.
This is why we need really good endpoint protection right now, because yeah, antivirus software is probably not going to detect this. So Matt, do you want to tell us a little bit about the BlackCat attack that we just handled last month? I think this was a great illustrative example.
Yeah, this had a lot of the hallmarks that we're really emphasizing in this presentation. So BlackCat is a ransomware strain, or a ransomware group, that also operates on the data exposure and ransomware as a service model that we're very familiar with at this time. They hit a company based in New York City, had about 150 people on staff, a lot of people working from home, and they were using a Citrix remote access system to facilitate their remote employees. So on January 18th, the IT staff noticed a large amount of data being sent outbound from their network. They got a report back on their Citrix usage, and they could see a big spike of about 600 extra gigabytes of data that they weren't expecting or was kind of out of the norm. Now, unfortunately, at that point, they didn't really look farther into it. They thought it was kind of an anomaly. Maybe somebody had uploaded or downloaded a series of large files, and they kind of let it go at that point. They later found out that that was their network's data being exfiltrated from their system by the BlackCat ransomware crew. On January 20th, just 2 days later, the criminals detonated their ransomware. And again, that's one of those trends that we saw in the CrowdStrike report. We've talked about dwell times before being long, 30, 60, 90 days. We're seeing a trend down on that, where the average dwell time and the time it takes adversaries to move through your system is much more compressed at this point because they know exactly what they're going for and what their ultimate outcome is.
Yeah, but 2 days is still long enough that you can prevent that ransomware from happening. So who is BlackCat? Why do I know this name?
Well, BlackCat, as it turns out, is allegedly a rebrand of a ransomware group that we're kind of familiar with at this point, and we'll talk about who that is in just a second. But talking about their targets, you might get a little bit of a head start on us here. BlackCat has been a fairly new operator on the scene. They've only been around for a few months at this point, but they've started going after some pretty large-scale targets, including a large-scale German oil company. And this should harken back to another oil company that we're familiar with being in the news, the Colonial Pipeline attack. As it turns out, it looks like there is a solid connection between BlackCat and Black Matter or DarkSide, the ransomware crew that was responsible for that very disruptive and very resource-consuming cyber attack we saw last year.
I love that they said here target selection mistakes. So they are changing their name every time they mess up and they get in the news, right?
Exactly, and again, this is one of those trends that we'll get into here. But this rebranding that they're going through is a pretty solid indicator that they're up to no good and have been for quite some time.
Right. Okay, so what's so interesting about the BlackCat ransomware? I know that you brought this to my attention. If you could share it with the audience, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course, and I won't go too deep into the technical details on this because that's a little outside the scope of this presentation, but one of the really notable things that we picked up on with this specific ransomware group was the use of a new and different kind of ransomware. And by different, I don't mean it does something besides encrypting. That's what it does, obviously. But the way it's put together makes it a lot more difficult to, one, detect and two, stop. The way that adversaries are going about this is shifting their focus away from more traditional programming languages like C and C++ into newer programming languages like Go and Rust and Nim. These are very fast, very efficient languages. They are difficult to detect because they don't operate on the same signature-based libraries that we're kind of used to working with, and that's what most antivirus software actually works with. They're very good at evading detection, and they can target multiple operating systems. So this is one of the rare instances where we see a ransomware strain that can go after Windows, it can go after Linux, it can go after embedded devices. There is a very wide range of uses for this. It's also very customizable, which makes it a very big problem for an organization if they're hit with something like this.
So can we get ransomware on our phone much more easily now?
I think we're pretty close to that point at this point.
I'm a little nervous, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I know another interesting thing about this case is that BlackCat wanted Monero, is that right? And by the way, good job on this negotiation. They wanted $500,000, and I know that then they ended up going down to $185,000 for Monero. Why don't you tell us what happened from there?
Yeah, so we were really excited because we obviously got a great deal for the victim in this negotiation. Went from $500,000 down to $185,000, and then the adversary came back and said, "Okay, but if you pay in Bitcoin, we're going to charge you an extra 15% on top of that," meaning the ransom's now $217,500. Not great news to deliver back to the victim at that point, but it shows another one of those shifts that we're seeing into using a more privacy-focused cryptocurrency instead of using Bitcoin. The adversary at this point is really trying to get their funds into a form that they can move around without being traced or detected. And this is, again, something we're seeing in darknet marketplaces and other cybercrime gangs all over the place.
So they didn't end up charging you 15%. You knocked them down to $200K, is that right?
Yeah, we got them down to $200K overall as a flat rate. So,
you must be a shark at
still a
garage
pretty
sales.
good deal, but yeah.
All right, how traceable is Bitcoin?
So yeah, the myth of untraceable Bitcoin is kind of being thrown on its face here, and we've seen this in a couple of different cases. Bitcoin, you have to remember, is anonymous but is not necessarily private. Any transactions that are conducted on the Bitcoin blockchain are public. Anyone can see them. Anyone can trace them. Companies like Chainalysis are experts at following flows of illicit funds through the blockchain like that. It also means that since we know where those funds are going, we can sometimes recover those funds. And there are a couple of great examples of that. Colonial Pipeline is a really good example where a large portion of the ransom they paid was able to be recovered by the FBI a little bit later on down the road. But this means that there are steps that cybercriminals are having to take to obscure those transactions. One of those is a mixing service, and we'll get into the use of that here in a second. But the mixing service is essentially money laundering for the 21st century. You have a large amount of cryptocurrency that you want to transfer into something you can actually use, so you send it to a mixer, and the mixer is a third party, will then convert that cryptocurrency either into other cryptocurrencies or into different amounts in other wallets and then send it back to you. This makes tracing those currency transactions a lot more difficult. Not impossible, but a lot more difficult than a simple point-to-point transaction. And in fact, just last year, we saw one of the major Bitcoin mixers that have been in operation for over 10 years at that point actually get busted. And this was a service called Bitcoin Fog. They were busted for laundering over $335 million worth of cryptocurrencies over the 10 years they were in operation. So again, these crackdowns are not just affecting the cyber criminals themselves, but the services they rely on. So how are these things actually tracked is a question that we get a lot from people. And the answer is, well, it can be pretty straightforward. The encryption used on the blockchain is solid. You're probably not going to break that. But there are other things that can play into that, which will allow law enforcement to track where these funds are going and where they're actually residing. One of those is criminal seizures. So if a large-scale group is taken down by law enforcement, the computers that are then confiscated can be used to access that cryptocurrency. There could be wallet keys or identifying information. We also see dark web markets being busted, and since cryptocurrency is, well, the preferred payment method on the dark web, there's a lot of transactional information that can show how those funds are flowing around. Then again, we can look at public sources like blockchain analysis, and we can also get down to what are called know your customer or KYC regulations, where in a lot of large-scale what is the word I'm looking for here? Centralized cryptocurrency exchanges like Coinbase or something like that, or Binance, you actually do have to prove your own identity to have a wallet. So if that cryptocurrency ends up in one of those wallets and it is one of those large-scale exchanges, there's a chance they can get an actual person on the other end of that instead of just a random string of letters and numbers.
Well, and it seems like what's happening is they're really getting them at the point where they're changing cryptocurrency into actual like US dollars or some other kind of legitimate currency. They get that identity, and then because the Bitcoin ledger is public, they can then trace all of the other transactions associated with it as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. There's a trail. It's just a little bit more difficult to follow. Great example of that is the shot you see right at the bottom of the screen, and it's the Department of Justice seizure of $3.6 billion in Bitcoin from a heist that actually took place quite a while ago. So this was a Bitcoin heist that took place against an exchange that was running out of Hong Kong called Bitfinex. And in 2016, about 94,000 Bitcoin was stolen by the couple you see on the screen in front of you, and that is Ilya Lichtenstein and his wife Heather Morgan. These were the masterminds behind one of the largest cryptocurrency heists in history. Now, at the time, 94,000 Bitcoin was still a lot of money. That was about $40 million in cryptocurrency. The value now, though, has been boosted up to about $4.5 billion. When it was actually taken, it was $3.6 billion, but with how cryptocurrency fluctuates, we see that number all over the place. What was really unique about this was the laundry list of techniques that these two used to try to obfuscate their transactions and launder their ill-gotten Bitcoin. And they tried a bunch of different methods, cashing out at Bitcoin ATMs, buying gift cards, buying tangible assets like gold, NFTs, a lot of stuff. Obviously, it did not work to the way they wanted it to, but it was amazing to see the lengths that they were willing to go to try to hide these funds. So with all that in play, how were these two actually caught? Well, following the money seems to be the way to go about these things. And Lisa Monaco, the deputy AG from the United States, has put this perfectly. She said it's what led us to Al Capone in the 1930s. It helped destroy La Cosa Nostra in the 1960s, and it took down terrorist financing in the early 2000s. Following that flow of money through its the criminal marketplaces really led to this. A major component was also the takedown of the Alpha Bay market. It was a dark web marketplace that was taken offline in 2017 and was being used as a mixing service by these two. Once the servers were taken from Alpha Bay, they were able to track the transactions through the mixing service and link them back to their original locations, sources, and destinations. This was a 5-year law enforcement effort to bring these two down, and it is amazing the level of detail that had to be tracked in order to make this case solid.
Well, and it's so fascinating because in the early days of cybercrime, of course, we did see criminals getting busted. Shadow Crew is a great example. They made payments in PayPal and eGold, in addition to just cash. And then the farmers market on the dark web, that was another one that was taken down, and people were paying in Western Union. And there were two ways that criminals would bust them. Number one, by following the communications with email, but then criminals got smarter and the dark web came out. And then when they didn't have that option, they would follow the money. Once cryptocurrency came out, we didn't really have a good system for mapping that back, but it seems like law enforcement has now developed that with the help of services that really analyze the blockchain.
Yep.
Okay, so Matt, why don't you tell us about the blockchain and how criminals are trying to evade detection these days?
Yeah, of course. And this is another one of those trends that we talked about a little bit earlier with the BlackCat case that we were going through. There's been a shift away, or an effort to shift away, from Bitcoin as a transaction or a fund for transaction in cybercriminal enterprise. The reason being what we just went over. Bitcoin is largely traceable, and there's a good reason for that on the back end. They're shifting to cryptocurrencies that are more privacy focused, like Monero as a prime example. And this is honestly the one that we see as the primary alternative to Bitcoin for both dark web purchases and ransomware. Monero is a cryptocurrency that is built for privacy. It has a public ledger just like everything else does, but it utilizes obfuscation techniques within that ledger to block the viewing of transaction amounts, the sender addresses, the receiving addresses, and they do so using a bunch of really interesting techniques like the use of public key encryption and false wallets. Again, this is how criminals are attempting to hide their transactions from law enforcement and keep themselves from being tracked. We'll see whether or not that's going to be effective, or if people are actually going to be paying ransoms in Monero. It's still a pretty low portion of them that are, but it is a trend that we're going to be watching.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, in theory, it is possible to be anonymous in Bitcoin, especially if you never ever want to cash out and change into US dollars. One other thing we're seeing is that criminals are often creating a fresh new wallet for every transaction. And what that means is if you go to look up that wallet in the OFAC list to see if it's associated with a sanctioned entity, it's almost certainly not going to come up with any results. But after the fact, if that is added, you may then have to report later. So just keep that in mind. All right, going back to our government's 4-point plan. Nice meme here, Matt. I do like to surprise me. A third method that the government is using to track down the criminals and dismantle their operations is to disrupt laundering. So check out the screenshot here. Again, this is from the Chainalysis 2022 Crypto Crime Report. The total value of cryptocurrency laundered each year is on the screen here. And in 2021, it's $8.6 billion. So up significantly from 2020, although not at its all-time high. I suspect one of the reasons we're seeing that drop compared with 2019 is that more criminals are using coins that are more difficult to trace, like Monero. So Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about exchanges and their role in this process?
Yeah, so the cryptocurrency exchange is really going to be the platform that a criminal has to use to either transfer their funds into something they can tangibly use, like USD Tether or another stable coin that can be cashed out for actual currency. But the interesting thing that we're seeing here is the use of centralized versus decentralized exchanges. Whether the exchange they're working through is going to be something like Coinbase or Binance, which has some actual regulation behind it, or something like SUEX, which we'll talk about here in a minute, which is a largely unsupervised kind of cryptocurrency market. We're still seeing about half of that traffic coming through centralized exchanges, which is a good chance for us to actually catch who is behind these transactions in the real world, rather than just an address on the blockchain.
So again, we're seeing the U.S. government take real clear action right now. In the fall, they sanctioned their first cryptocurrency exchange, SUEX. It's based in Russia, has been around since about 2018. And some of the reasons they sanctioned it were because about 40% of the transactions were associated with known bad actors. You can see in the chart, they were able to identify over 12 million of transactions specifically associated with ransomware, 20 million associated with darknet markets, specifically Hydra, 24 million associated with scams and others. And there were also 8 different variants of ransomware that were using the SUEX cryptocurrency exchange. So it is no longer legal for United States persons to be doing business with the SUEX cryptocurrency exchange. And so that has some major impacts on its viability. So Matt, tell us a little bit about some other developments with cryptocurrency enforcement.
Yeah, so the United States government has created a couple of positions and agencies that are really focusing on cryptocurrency at this point. The Justice Department just announced they have a director for their National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team. This just happened a few days ago. And there is a new cryptocurrency unit that the FBI has put into play that is specifically for tracking illegal transactions through cryptocurrency. Again, really neat change of direction that we're seeing here, which we haven't had before. So this will actually have some effects on you if you are someone who uses cryptocurrency or trades in cryptocurrency. One of the big things that we're probably going to see is a drop in the number of decentralized exchanges that are being really popularly used for legitimate transactions. Now, cryptocurrency by itself obviously is not inherently dishonest or criminal. It is, much like many other things that criminals use, something that has a good real-world use that is being used for illicit purposes. Because of that, we can expect to see some new regulations. There's probably going to be more identity verification steps, more know your customer regulations put in place, more tracking of transactions, more tax implications for cryptocurrency. So we'll see where that goes. We'll also see undoubtedly an impact on legitimate cryptocurrency transactions. Again, this is not something that only criminals use. Lots of people use cryptocurrency. Many people trade in it. Many people use it for payments. These regulations will have an impact on that. We'll probably also see more reporting requirements and retroactive compliance checks. That one's big. That retroactive nature of seeing if an entity that you've paid is a sanctioned entity on OFAC's list or something along those lines.
It can take years to bring criminals to justice, and they want to be able to track all of the organizations that a certain criminal has hacked or attempted to hack. Speaking of which, we are also likely to see an increase in notification requirements should you get hit with ransomware or pay a ransom. In the Senate, we saw a proposed 24-hour ransomware notification bill that actually has had a lot of support and a lot of conversation with the public. There have been there's been quite a bit of discussion and some proposed legislation on a national breach notification law or very quick reporting requirements. And again, this is because law enforcement agencies and regulators and the government want to start getting a clear picture of what the problem is. The Senate is currently urging the SEC to expand their cyber incident reporting rules. So a lot of movement from many different directions. One area where we've seen actual legislation that got passed is in banking. So in the fall, we saw a new cybersecurity reporting rule come out. This was a coordinated effort between the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, the OCC, and others. And the upshot is that banks need to report certain types of cybersecurity incidents to regulators within 36 hours. Now, if that seems fast to you, it's because it is. Remember, though, this is not a public notification. This is really a private-ish notification to your regulator. And this really helps our nation to identify threats that may be facing the banking system as quickly as possible. And that way, if there's issues across the country, regulators have an early heads up about that, and we're better prepared to take quick action against it. And this doesn't apply to all incidents. There's a focus on operations. It's not specific to cybersecurity. It's really any type of incident. They call it a notification incident that might affect the banking operations in a nutshell. So that doesn't just apply to the banks. It also applies to certain bank suppliers that might then be required to notify the bank. So it's also a really notable development that there's a regulation that applies not just to a certain industry, but those that also provide technology services to that industry as well. So that goes into effect April 1st, April 1st is the effective date, May 1st is the compliance date. Before that time, make sure that you're designating the points of contact that you need to report to and also who on your team is going to be responsible for reporting. Make sure you also have clear guidelines for your own team on how to identify notification incidents. What type of incidents need to get reported to your regulator? I'm going to be giving a webinar with my colleague and friend Michael Kleiman on March 2nd. So if you are a regulated organization, feel free to tune in. We're just going to be summarizing exactly what you need to do. All right, so finally, the last part of the U.S. government's 4-point plan is to help our nation bolster resilience to withstand ransomware attacks. And remember, ransomware attacks are often a precursor to other attacks. The underlying issues that facilitate ransomware attacks are the same that facilitate many other types of cybercrime. So if you can prevent ransomware, you can prevent all other kinds of problems. So let's take a look at the case we were looking at with BlackCat. Matt, one thing that was helpful here, I know you did forensics on this, but the criminals also monologued. They gave you a detailed list of what they did, which matched what your findings were, correct?
Yeah, that was a nice little verification of the findings on our end, so we were happy about that. But yeah, they gave us a step-by-step on how they got into the organization and actually scolded us because there were some pretty poor security, or what they identified as poor security practices in place. So the first thing they pointed out was there was an old critical vulnerability that was not fixed on the Citrix VPN system that the victim had been using. And as we found out, this was a vulnerability from 2019 that had just never been patched. Remote code execution vulnerability, the attackers were able to get basically right in the door at that point. Once they got in the door, they found a database of passwords on the system. And this is something that we have harped on in a lot of our webinars, but this is one of the very first things attackers will often go after. A spreadsheet with passwords, a Word document with passwords, a note file. Either way, they were able to find this database and use those passwords to then branch out into pretty much everywhere else in the system because there were administrative level credentials there. They also got into the Veeam system. They extracted credentials from the browser. While they were doing all of this, they were uploading that data to mega.co in order to engage in that exposure extortion angle. So this is all happening in between those couple of dates that we showed between January 18th and January 20th. It was a very, very short window of activity, very effective, but again, very short.
So what can you do to protect against this? First of all, it's so common for criminals to just start scraping passwords off your systems. Make sure, like we've said before, that you are not storing passwords in files. After this presentation, run, don't walk, delete your files with passwords, even if you think you're being sneaky about it. And instead use a password manager. You can use LastPass, you can use Dashlane, 1Password, just use something that's reputable. Make sure that you're generating a unique password for each website. It's not possible for people to remember all of those. You can also use these systems to securely share passwords amongst teams because sometimes teams, especially IT teams, do need to escrow and share passwords. And there's ways to do that more securely if you're using a password manager. If you do use a password manager in the cloud, of course, make sure to use multi-factor authentication to protect it. All right, speaking of multi-factor authentication, expect your passwords to get stolen. Expect that they are getting stolen. It's so critical for us to be using multi-factor authentication. In this case, the criminals could steal the passwords and it would have stopped them from getting into some other systems on the network if multi-factor authentication were in place. It can stop them from getting into the cloud. As we talked about during the Top Threats webinar last month, those cross-cloud attacks are happening all the time where they get access to one system, they use the password and information to get access to another system. So take a look, consider using either app-based multi-factor authentication, YubiKeys. We have lots of other options. Another good lesson learned from this BlackCat case is the importance of software patching. So for many of us, most of us probably didn't even hear about Log4j until December when it suddenly hit the news. Log4j is a library that is used by many different software products to facilitate logging. It is free and open source, and it has a vulnerability in it. And because it's used by so many vendors, that means that vendors are scrambling to determine if they're vulnerable and patch, and it can take weeks, months, or longer in order to understand if you're using a product that's vulnerable. So the FTC has come out with a statement, again, just in the past few weeks, saying all organizations need to patch Log4j. And if you don't patch Log4j, you might risk major fines. I think this article said it well. You can see it on the screen. Patch up or lawyer up. So the FTC making a very strong statement. Again, that regulatory response to risks. Is this really a new development to see so much pressure coming down from regulators and our national government? Pressure and also resources, as we'll see. Make sure you're routinely applying security patches. We see incidents all the time where criminals are breaking in using old Exchange vulnerabilities, Log4j. I know we had another penetration test this morning where our pen test team got into an organization by using the VMware server vulnerability because of Log4j. So often victims think that they're patched and don't realize that the patch for some reason wasn't fully installed. So make sure that you're patching and verifying as well. And again, the US government has put out a lot of new helpful resources. So starting in November, CISA came out with the Known and Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog, which includes not just the date added, but also a suggested fixed date as well, and more information about each of the vulnerabilities that we know are actively being exploited in the wild. So take advantage of that. All right, Matt, tell us how the BlackCat case ended.
All right, so how this case ended was kind of a double-edged sword. BlackCat had taken the victim's network completely offline at this point because they had wrecked their Citrix system, and obviously that needed to come back online, and they had encrypted pretty much everything inside the network. On the plus side, the victim in this case did have immutable backups ready to go. They had a Veeam system that utilized cloud storage for their backups and was not able to be encrypted. However, the adversary had about 600 gigabytes of their data, and this was not necessarily sensitive data, but the concept of being outed publicly for a ransomware incident and losing a bunch of data was fairly terrifying for the victim in this case, as it would be for most other organizations. So we again went forward with the negotiation. Once we came to the end of this, the ransom came out at $200,000. We were able to settle with the adversary at that point, bring the network back online, and get them out of the picture while avoiding public notification on their leak site and the DDoS attacks that they promised they would engage in if we didn't pay them. So again, another one of those multiple extortion angle trends that we're seeing.
I know most organizations these days have pretty solid backups. However, it's very important to look for that new term, immutable backups. That means even if a criminal gets administrative access to your system, which they did in this case, they still can't delete your backups. So there's usually a set window of time, 7 days, 14 days, that no one, not even your administrator, can delete or modify the backup. So make sure that you understand if you have immutable backups and exactly what that means. And test your backups or you don't have backups. All right, this illustrates another trend, again, which we talked about last month, and that is data leaking. What you're looking at on the screen here is Lockbit 2.0's dark website. Nowadays, we're seeing not only are they leaking data, they've also ramped up the negotiation process, so they have conditions for partners and contacts. They don't necessarily want to be negotiating with your negotiation team. In some cases, these criminals have their own ransom negotiation team that they want you to use. So a whole new next level when it comes to data leaking, and we don't expect it to go away. Matt, it looks like this, I believe you just added this because it came out of CrowdStrike's report this morning. Is that right? Can you share?
Yeah, I pulled this from the report this morning because it really perfectly illustrates this point. Data exposure inside of cyber attacks is huge and is growing in all sectors across the board. There is no one sector that is safe from this. Even something like consumer goods, which by contrast had a fairly low level of data exposure attacks, in 2020 is seeing a really big jump in the amount of attacks that end in this threat of public disclosure of sensitive information. And again, as Sherry pointed out earlier, we're seeing this in about 84% of cases at this point. It's going to continue, and the laws and regulations are obviously going to change because of this.
So what's the reaction been from our government? Well, first of all, we are seeing a lot of laws regarding privacy and breach notification getting introduced. And this is the state privacy law tracker from Hush Blackwell. And you can see that over a quarter of states in the United States have active legislation surrounding privacy, many of which include notification requirements. At least 3 states have enacted legislation as well, California, Colorado, and Virginia. This is being driven not just by cybersecurity incidents, but also by increasing data collection. Biometrics is driving this as well, and other factors. But certainly the constant barrage of data leaking and data exposure cases is really demonstrating to the public how much information is being collected and what the harm can be as a result of it. So just remember, as we've talked about before, data is hazardous material. The more data you have, the more it costs you to secure it and the more risk you have. Also, the more likely it is that laws will apply to you. So you may be storing sensitive information that you don't even know. In fact, a lot of the time when we see victims that have information exposed on the dark web, they didn't even know they were storing all of that information. So make sure that you're reducing your data. That means store less, delete more, and that will hopefully reduce your obligations as well if you go through and deliberately cull the data that could be regulated or sensitive. In order to do this, you need to routinely conduct data discovery and data mapping. I've seen quite a few companies, when you do data discovery for the first time, it's kind of shocking. It's like trying to find all the paper clips in an office building. There's way more than you think, and they're in all kinds of places. And then you can often get rid of half of it or 2/3 of it that you may never have even realized was there, these 20-year-old paper clips. We are also seeing a push at the federal level for revisions in the laws that may affect all of us. In one case, there's talk about reforming the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA. Also, a lot of conversation about SEC regulation, not just when it comes to reporting, but also proactive cybersecurity management from the board level on down. So the FTC has just in the past week proposed cybersecurity risk management rules for funds and advisors, and there's pressure to require public companies to have some cyber experts on their board. We've also seen, again, in addition to adding requirements, we've also seen a push from the federal government to provide you with more resources, which is awesome. This is the Stop Ransomware website, very practical and useful. It has a lot of different resources, so check it out. Another resource that's come out, and it's linked from that website, is the Cybersecurity Evaluation Tool, CSET. It is now available on GitHub. You can see the link on the screen here, and you can use it to do a ransomware readiness assessment. So go through, if you have time, check it out. It's really useful. In November, CISA came out with cybersecurity incident and vulnerability response playbooks. So you can, if you don't already have a playbook, you can start by adopting those, or you can just review and use pieces of those to update your incident response plans. We've already talked about the importance of reviewing and updating your IR plans as a response to new notification requirements, and this can help just by getting you additional language to include. All right, finally, the US government has shared 5 high-impact defenses, and I think it's interesting the ones they picked. Number 1, multi-factor authentication. That is no surprise to anybody. We're seeing it from all angles. Also, endpoint detection is critical. As we've seen, the criminals are getting very good at evading antivirus. They're often not using malware, more often than not. In addition to detection, you also need to have response. And 76% of the time, the criminals are installing ransomware after normal business hours or on the weekends. So you have to have 24/7 monitoring in place. They want you to have encryption. So we talked about that in our How Encryption Works webinar, but make sure that you are encrypting sensitive databases so that when the criminals steal data, it doesn't necessarily have to trigger a data breach notification. And in order to implement a strong security program, you need to have a skilled and empowered security team. I think nobody can argue with that. You can always outsource to supplement information if you're having a hard time hiring. I know it's very difficult to hire in cybersecurity right now, but a lot of other issues like lack of patches and things like that are related to the need for a strong and empowered security team. So Matt, I'm just curious, what do you think about this list? I was surprised that training wasn't on it, and then I was like, patching needs to be on it too, and there need to be 4 other things, and I guess that's not a top 5, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're going to keep it to 5, they did a good job, but there are other things that need to be included as well that are I would argue, equally as high impact, and employee training, I think, has to be top of that list.
Absolutely. And let's make it 6 and add employee training. Okay, so if you want more information about proactive measures, check out our webinar, How to Optimize Your Cybersecurity Program, where we have some information that will help you plan and budget for cybersecurity. Also, by implementing proactive measures, that can help you even if you do suffer a cybersecurity incident. And HIPAA is a great example. Last year, HIPAA signed the Safe Harbor Act into law. And so now HHS does need to consider any proactive measures that you put into place at least 12 months beforehand when they're calculating fines and considering enforcement. So there's more leniency if you've done things like conducted a risk analysis and actually reduced risk to a low or acceptable level. Similarly, there was an update to the OFAC Advisory this fall, where they likewise said that any impacted organizations that take steps like maintaining offsite backups, developing IR plans, instituting cybersecurity training, updating antivirus and anti-malware software, employing authentication, that can trigger some leniency as well in the event that you are potentially hit with some enforcement. So with that, just to summarize our trends, we're seeing that law enforcement actions are truly disrupting the cyber criminals. Really great to see. But as a result, the adversaries are shifting tactics. We're seeing more portable malware that is more virulent, difficult to detect. We're seeing them move to alternate payment methods, or they're trying to use things like cryptocurrency, and they're continuing that data exposure extortion, which can be done even without malware. The result of all of this and all these trends is that we're seeing new reporting requirements, specifically for banks and credit unions, and we're likely likely to see other ones down the road. There's also a big unified push for proactive cybersecurity practices, so that needs to be a top priority in the coming year. So what does this mean for you? Number one, deploy proactive security measures. Multi-factor authentication is top of the list. I know we sound like broken records. I feel like Matt said yesterday, we need broken records on like every slides. Also look for EDR, endpoint detection and response software, which includes 24/7 monitoring. Look for that keyword immutable backups and make sure you have it in place. Look at how you store your passwords and manage them, and then patch your software and verify that you're patching. Also, there's new laws and regulations that are popping up like popcorn all the time. So make sure that you're monitoring for those and incorporating them into your plans, and update those plans and your notification requirements. Matt, anything you wanted to add to that?
Nope, I think that is the exact same list that the BlackCat adversary sent us as their recommendation, so we're on the same page here.
We're in line with the criminals. This is what we need to do.
So with that, Matt, I'll let you do the takeaway.
Of course. Thank you so much. Once again, yes, this has been Matt Duran and Sherry Davidoff with LMG Security. If you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to reach out to us. You can get us at info@lmgsecurity.com. Find us on Twitter at LMG Security. You can find us on LinkedIn. And again, if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to answer.
Yep, and tune in for our March 2nd webinar on the 36-hour cybersecurity incident notification requirements.
Sherry and Matt, thank you so much for that informative webinar today. Once again, I would like to thank everyone who attended today's session. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.